Today we're going to look at cnidarians. And cnidarians are essentially going to include jellyfish, sea anemones, hydras. They have two body forms, a polyp and a medusa. The polyp is more stationary or sessile, tends to be tubular. It has tentacles on one end and a basal disc on the other. The medusa is the free swimming form of a cnidarian. Here we see a couple of different examples of cnidarians. These are the multiple classes: Anthozoa, Scyphozoa, Staurozoa, Cubozoa, and Hydrozoa. Some sessile more typically than others. Others are going to be more the medusa stage. Here we can see just a couple of examples of cnidarians. You can see even the sessile or stationary types of cnidarians can move about in their environment to an extent, whereas something like the jellyfish is definitely free swimming and a good example of the medusa stage. Cnidarians are definitely like sponges in a couple of respects. They have two layers, an outer and inner layer, and it's separated by the mesoglea, or a jelly-like layer. That jelly-like layer kind of acts like a connective tissue to hold the ectoderm and endoderm together. Both the polyp and medusa have a single gastrovascular cavity and a mouth that is the only opening. So what goes in can also leave, but other things can actually also diffuse straight through their membranes. Epithelial layers of cells in a cnidarian are home also to nerve cells and contractile cells. The nerve cells are going to let this organism respond to outside stimuli, and the contractile cells allow the organisms to bend and move about, at least partially, in their environment. All cnidarians show radial symmetry. They all have a mouth with a sac-like gut called the gastrovascular cavity. They all consist of cnidocytes that contain nematocysts, and nematocysts are on tentacles, and they're small capsules that contain a toxin that can be ejected into prey or predators. Here is an example of the nematocyst. Again, the nematocyst is the spear-like component contained within the cell called the cnidocyte, and the cnidocyte, when triggered, will release the nematocyst, and oftentimes the nematocyst can be used for a warning signal. The main function of nematocysts is definitely capturing prey. It might be good at warning off predators, but capturing prey is the goal. The toxin actually in the nematocyst that's released is supposed to paralyze creatures, and then once paralyzed, cnidarians can eat that organism. But depending on the chemistry of the creature, you may not see paralyzation, you might just see an irritating sting. Here are some more examples of nematocysts being released. You can actually see on the left some venom or a toxin released at the end. And then on the right, we have a hydra, a type of cnidarian, using the cnidocysts and the nematocytes on their tentacles to capture water fleas. And once a cnidarian has captured prey, it takes it into its mouth, into its sac-like digestive cavity called the gastrovascular cavity, and it's going to use extracellular digestion to digest that food. Any undigested foodstuff will also have to exit out the same way it entered. Cnidarians don't really have structures for respiration or excretion either. They have such thin membranes that they can actually excrete waste and breathe through their skin. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. Asexually is commonly by budding, like we saw in sponges, and some cnidarians can also produce sexually, and they usually do so at least at one part in their life cycle. We'll look at hydras, for example. They're commonly going to exist in the polyp stage. They have a gastrovascular cavity, they have tentacles with nematocysts, and they're going to be able to breathe through their skin, and they're going to be able to excrete through their skin as well. Now, they're primarily going to be in the sessile stationary stage, the polyp stage, but they can move about very freely with their tentacles, but tend to stay in a similar habitat. Here you can see that the basic anatomy of a hydra shows that it contains both gametes for testes and ovaries, and it could use both of those in order to cause fertilization or sexual reproduction. So even though the hydra can perform sexual reproduction, its primary method of reproduction is via budding or fragmentation. You can see a bud on the lower right side of the basic anatomy here for the hydra, and budding produces clones, but it can be a form of reproduction that produces more organisms. Here we're looking at a little bit more for the digestion of something like food in a cnidarian. We're still using the hydra as our example. We can see with its basic anatomy that it's taking food in via its mouth, putting it in the gastrovascular cavity, Then using enzymes to break down that food, and once broken down, it can engulf those broken down nutrients via endocytosis, and any leftovers will exit out the mouth or through the skin. So hydras we know produce sexually and asexually. They tend to produce more asexually and only once sexually, and they have both testes and ovaries on the same organism. And in that case, we would actually consider hydras hermaphroditic because they contain both egg and sperm. It can release both to the water and essentially allow fertilization to occur from the same organism. Sea anemones are similar to hydra in that they lack a medusa stage and primarily exist as a polyp, even if they are a polyp that can move around a bit. Now, sea anemones use nematocysts as well. They're on their tentacles. They would paralyze and capture prey using the nematocysts. And sea anemones are usually deadly to fish, except for one. The exception is the clownfish. The sea anemone has actually a symbiotic relationship with the clownfish. It's protected from predators, and then the movement of the clownfish around the sea anemone actually attracts other fish to the sea anemone, and that's food for the sea anemone. So that's going to be a mutualistic relationship, which is a type of symbiosis where both organisms benefit. Sea anemones actually are able to chemically recognize the clownfish and therefore not trigger its nematocysts. We're not sure exactly how this symbiotic relationship evolved to specifically not target the clownfish, but it is one that's very fascinating and does exist. So here you can see some movement for the sea anemones. Here is one eating on the left, so it's taking in essentially a sea slug that's a little too curious. And on the right, we can see the clownfish enjoying its mutualistic relationship with a sea anemone, very freely moving against its tentacles and not being stung by its nematocysts, but other fish would be. Corals are essentially tiny polyps that live in calcium carbonate cup-like structures. These stone-like structures are essentially the house where the polyp form of a coral lives. While a coral is alive, it lives in its stone-like house, but it remains essentially flexible enough that these cup-like structures can open and close. And when they're open, the coral can feed, and when it closes, it's hidden away from any possible predators. So the cup can open and close, protecting the coral. So here you can see some coral tentacles extending out of the calcium carbonate skeleton that they contain. Sometimes it's going to be multiple extensions that have tiny tentacles at the end. Other times it's going to be kind of a large amount of tentacles that come out, feed, and then later will retract into the carbon skeleton. Here's a closer look at coral anatomy. You can see that we still have one mouth and a gastrovascular cavity. We also have tentacles with nematocysts and two germ layers, an outer epidermis and an inner endodermis connected by mesoglia. However, a difference would be the calcium carbonate skeleton that is protective and can open and close. We can also see another mutualistic relationship between the red-spotted coral crab and coral. The red-spotted coral crab's relationship with coral is another example of a symbiosis. The coral actually provides the crab with a place to live, and the crab protects the coral from predators by pinching them with its claws if they get too close. And coral is very important. Even once coral dies, it leaves its exoskeleton, and that's going to become essentially the substrate or the rock bed from which new coral can essentially attach themselves. So as corals begin to die, more corals attach themselves to the top of dead ones. That enlarges the size of the coral colony, with only the kind of topmost portions or outermost portions of the coral bed being alive. But that creates colonies that are so large that they form reefs. And great coral reefs can stretch for miles. And they become really important ecosystems, especially in warm, shallow marine waters where they're home to thousands of organisms. We can also look at jellyfish. Jellyfish are an example of an cnidarian that has both a polyp and a medusa stage, but you're probably more familiar with the free-swimming medusa stage. That is the dominant stage. And the common jellyfish exists as either male or female during the medusa stage, but it's not really either during its polyp stage. So in the medusa stage, the male jellyfish would release sperm, that would swim in the water. Some of these sperm actually enter the gut of the female, the gastrovascular cavity, and that would be where the female egg would be located and waiting to be fertilized. When fertilization takes place, that will form a zygote. The zygote will develop slightly before exiting the female Medusa jellyfish through the mouth, and then it will cling to the female's tentacles for a while. And after some development, the zygote that was clinging to the female's tentacles will become either a male or female planula, essentially an early polyp jellyfish, that will swim away and attach itself to some type of underwater base or substrate. It will slowly grow into something bigger, something that resembles the polyp form of a jellyfish, and this polyp form could asexually reproduce then by budding. Doesn't always, but it would eventually undergo a very dramatic shift from this kind of polyp column shaped structure to something that becomes very cylindrical with stacked rings. And then these rings eventually separate, with each ring becoming a free swimming Medusa. That's what we're seeing here in the image to the right. We're seeing a jellyfish go through essentially the fertilization stage into a planula, the attached polyp that we call an early planula. The planula then develops into a mature polyp that then can turn into cylindrical rings that we call a budding polyp. And each bud off of a budding polyp can turn from an ephyra, an immature jelly, into an adult jellyfish. Then the cycle repeats again. Jellyfish do have tentacles. They do have nematocysts. Their nematocysts are going to, if they sting humans, cause swelling, pain, and sometimes death depending on the type of jellyfish you're stung by. Here are some examples of jellyfish stings. You can also see in the lower left how complicated and complex the nematocyst of a jellyfish is, as opposed to some of the simpler ones we saw with the sea anemones and the hydra. So again, depending on the type of jellyfish that stings you, it can be fatal. Here's the base anatomy of a jellyfish. We have the bell, which is kind of the top portion of the jellyfish, the tentacles. The tentacles are generally going to be of two types, the ones that have the nematocyst and the ones that are going to be kind of just on the outside and more neural to sense the environment. The ones that have the nematocyst are sometimes called oral arms because they have the stinging cells, they have the nematocyst that can essentially be utilized to capture prey. Then these longer arms can be used to kind of shuttle that prey towards the gastrovascular cavity. Occasionally, you might have some sensory areas on the bell that might act as an eye spot. There's some muscle cells, there's going to be some canals, but the main parts again are going to be the bell and the tentacles and the gastrovascular cavity that's led to via the mouth. And that's it for part B related to chapter 13.